The desert wind tasted of dust and regret as Ezekiel Marsh stared at the hanging rope. A man dangled at its end, boots kicking at the emptiness. Not just any man, but the deputy, cold and still. Around him, the posse shifted, rifles heavy, eyes heavier. They looked to Ezekiel for a word, a sign. He was the law here in this corner of Arizona Territory, 1881, such as it was. He tracked Jedediah Black across 3 counties, brought him to justice for killing a man in cold blood. Except, looking at the boy now, barely a man himself, Ezekiel saw not a murderer, but a scared kid with eyes too wide and a story untold. The posse wanted blood. The law demanded it. But something in Ezekiel's gut churned, a silent scream against the brutal calculus of frontier justice. The sun beat down, relentless. Ezekiel felt it on his weathered face, a physical weight matching the one in his heart. Jedediah Black was guilty, no doubt. He'd admitted as much, face streaked with tears, begging for forgiveness, a plea lost on the hardened men around him. They'd seen too much death, too much loss. Mercy was a weakness they could no longer afford. But Ezekiel remembered a time before the badge, before the dust and the grit, when forgiveness felt like a virtue, not a liability. Now, he felt the weight of their expectation, the silent pressure to uphold the very system that had slowly eroded his own soul. He cleared his throat, the sound raspy in the still air. "Cut him down," he said, the words barely audible. A collective gasp rippled through the posse. Faces hardened, disbelief etched into every line. Silas, the oldest of the group, a man who'd lost his wife and children to a raiding party years ago, stepped forward. "You can't be serious, Marsh. He killed Deputy Clem. In cold blood." Ezekiel met his gaze, unflinching. "The law says an eye for an eye, Silas. But what good does another dead man do us? What does it bring back?" The argument hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Silas spat on the ground, a gesture of pure contempt. "It brings justice, Marsh. Something you seem to have forgotten about." Others muttered in agreement, their faith in him visibly shaken. He saw it in their eyes, the slow realization that the man they'd trusted, the man who'd always been so steadfast, was now wavering. He could feel their respect slipping away, replaced by a cold, hard distrust. And he wondered, not for the first time, if he was making a terrible mistake. Ezekiel ignored the rising tide of dissent and nodded to another member of the posse, a younger man named Thomas. Thomas, hesitant but loyal, stepped forward with his knife and severed the rope. Jedediah's body slumped to the ground, lifeless. Ezekiel knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. Faint, but there. He looked up at the posse, his face grim. "He's alive. We'll take him back to town. He'll stand trial." The grumbling intensified. He knew what they were thinking. A trial meant lawyers, loopholes, a chance for Jedediah to walk free. In their minds, justice was swift and certain, delivered not in a courtroom, but at the end of a rope. Back in town, the mood was even worse. The townsfolk had loved Deputy Clem. He was a good man, a fair man. His death had left a gaping hole in the community, a wound that demanded vengeance. The ranch hand brought Jedediah back, barely conscious and bruised. The crowd surged forward, a mob hungry for blood. He had to fight his way through, pushing and shoving, his own men barely able to contain the fury. He felt the hatred radiating off them, a palpable force that threatened to consume him. He'd spared a life, but in doing so, he placed his own in jeopardy. He locked Jedediah in the jail, a flimsy structure that wouldn't hold back a determined crowd. He knew he needed to get him out of town, away from the simmering rage. But where could he take him? Every town, every settlement would be the same, a thirst for revenge, a demand for retribution. He was alone, caught between the law and the people, between justice and mercy. And the silence from the tribal nations, like the drifter, added another layer of uncertainty. The encroaching civilization was a slow burn, and the repercussions for a perceived weakness could be deadly. Later that night, Ezekiel sat in his office, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. He couldn't shake the feeling that he betrayed something, some fundamental principle that had guided him for so long. He'd always believed in the law, in the power of justice to heal and to restore. But now, he wondered if he'd been a fool. If the law, in this unforgiving land, was nothing more than a thin veneer over the brutal reality of survival. He heard a knock at the door. Silas stood there, his face grim. "They're coming for him, Marsh," he said. "The whole town. They won't be denied." Ezekiel knew this was coming. He'd seen the anger in their eyes, the determination in their faces. He could try to stop them, but he knew it would be futile. He was one man against a mob, a single voice against a chorus of rage. He looked at Silas, his old friend, and saw the pain in his eyes, the deep-seated grief that fueled his desire for revenge. He understood it, he truly did. But understanding didn't make it right. He stood up, his bones aching, his spirit weary. "Then we'll have to move him," he said. "Get him out of here before they arrive." Silas hesitated. "Where to, Marsh?" "There's nowhere he'll be safe." Ezekiel didn't answer. He didn't know where to take him. He only knew that he couldn't let them lynch him. Not tonight. As they crept through the back alleys of the town, the mob's roar growing closer, Ezekiel felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He'd chosen mercy, but mercy had a price, and he was about to pay it. They reached the edge of town, where Ezekiel had stabled his horse and another for Jedediah. He hoisted the unconscious young man onto the horse. As he was adjusting him, he heard a noise behind him. A rustle in the bushes. He turned, drawing his gun, but it was too late. A figure emerged from the shadows, a rifle raised. It was Thomas, the young man who had cut Jedediah down from the rope. He looked at Ezekiel, his face contorted with anger and betrayal. "You can't do this, Marsh," he said, his voice trembling. "You can't let him go." Ezekiel lowered his gun, his heart sinking. He'd thought he could trust Thomas, that he understood. But he was wrong. He saw the unwavering conviction in his eyes, the belief that justice demanded blood. He knew what Thomas was going to do. He could try to stop him, but he was too tired, too worn down. He'd fought so hard to save Jedediah, but now he realized that he couldn't save him from himself. Thomas raised the rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ezekiel closed his eyes, bracing for the shot. But it never came. Instead, he heard a grunt, a thud, and then silence. He opened his eyes and saw Silas standing behind Thomas, a knife in his hand. Thomas crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Silas looked at Ezekiel, his face etched with a mixture of regret and determination. "He was going to kill him, Marsh," he said. "I couldn't let him." Ezekiel stared at Silas, speechless. He'd saved Jedediah's life, but at the cost of another. The cycle of violence seemed endless, a never-ending spiral of death and revenge. He felt a profound sense of despair, a crushing realization that he couldn't escape the darkness that had consumed this land. He knew then that his decision to spare Jedediah had unleashed a chain of events that he could no longer control. "Take him," Silas said, gesturing toward Jedediah. "Get him out of here. I'll take care of this." Ezekiel hesitated. He didn't want to leave Silas alone, but he knew he had to. He had to get Jedediah to safety, to give him a chance at a new life. He mounted his horse and led Jedediah away, riding into the darkness, leaving Silas behind to face the consequences of his actions. As he rode, he thought about the choices he'd made, the path he'd taken. He'd tried to do what was right, to uphold the law, to show mercy. But in the end, all he'd accomplished was to bring more death and destruction. He wondered if he'd been naive, if he'd underestimated the power of hatred and revenge. He felt lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with no compass to guide him. Days later, he found a small settlement far beyond the reach of the town he'd left behind. He left Jedediah there, with a kind family who promised to care for him. He didn't tell them about his past, about the crime he'd committed. He simply said that he was a young man in need of a fresh start. He watched as Jedediah, still weak but slowly recovering, began to integrate into the community, to find a sense of belonging. He turned his horse west. He didn't stay to see Jedediah's new life unfold. He knew that his presence would only be a reminder of the past, a shadow that would haunt him forever. He rode away, alone, his heart heavy with the weight of his decisions. He'd spared the sheriff's killer, and White Wolf had taken its pound of flesh in return. He'd lost his friends, his reputation, and perhaps even his soul. Years passed. Ezekiel drifted from town to town, working odd jobs, never staying in one place for too long. He carried the memory of that night with him always, a constant reminder of the choices he'd made and the consequences that followed. He never heard from Jedediah again. He didn't know if he'd found happiness, if he'd managed to escape the shadow of his past. He only knew that he'd given him a chance. One evening, sitting by a campfire under a vast star-studded sky, he thought about Silas, about Thomas, about Deputy Clem. He thought about the town he'd left behind, the people he'd hurt, the lives he'd changed. He realized that mercy wasn't always easy, that it often came at a cost. But he also knew that it was necessary, that without it, there was only darkness. He looked up at the stars, their light ancient and unwavering. He wondered if they held the answers, if they could offer him some solace, some understanding. But the stars remained silent, indifferent to his pain, his regret. He was alone, with his thoughts, his memories, his choices. And he knew that he would have to live with them for the rest of his days. The desert stretched on, endless and unforgiving. He wondered if the weight of a single act could truly change the course of a river, or if the river, regardless of the obstacle, would eventually find its way to the sea. He felt like that river, diverted, choked by debris, but still, somehow, flowing. He found work as a wrangler on a sprawling ranch in Arizona. The owner, a gruff but fair man named Callahan, didn't ask questions. He needed a man who could ride, rope, and mend fences, and Ezekiel could do all those things. He kept his head down, avoided conversation, and worked from dawn till dusk. The physical labor was a balm, a way to exhaust the demons that haunted his waking hours. At night, he slept hard, dreamless sleeps fueled by exhaustion. The other wranglers were a mixed bunch, a collection of drifters and hard luck cases. They shared stories around the campfire, tales of lost loves, failed ventures, and run-ins with the law. Ezekiel listened, but he never offered his own. He was a ghost in their midst, present but detached. One day, a new hand arrived. His name was Caleb, a young man with bright eyes and a restless energy. He was eager to learn, quick to laugh, and unafraid to ask questions. He reminded Ezekiel of himself, years ago, before the darkness had taken root. Caleb took a liking to Ezekiel, drawn to his quiet competence and his unwavering work ethic. He peppered him with questions about horsemanship, about the land, about life. Ezekiel initially rebuffed his advances, wary of forming any connections. The drifter was persistent, and slowly, grudgingly, Ezekiel began to open up. He taught Caleb how to read the tracks of animals, how to predict the weather by the color of the sky, how to soothe a frightened horse with a gentle touch. He shared his knowledge, his skills, but he kept his past locked away. One evening, as they sat by the campfire, Caleb asked him a question that made Ezekiel's blood run cold. "You ever been to Redemption, mister?" Ezekiel froze. Redemption. The name echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder of all he had lost. He hadn't heard that name spoken in years. He forced himself to remain calm. "Redemption?" "Don't think so," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. Caleb nodded. "Small town. Heard some bad things happen there. Some kind of trouble." He looked at Ezekiel, his eyes searching. "You seem like a man who's seen his share of trouble." Ezekiel looked away, staring into the flames. "We all have," he said quietly. The conversation ended there, but Ezekiel couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb suspected something. He became more withdrawn, more guarded. He avoided Caleb whenever possible, afraid of what he might reveal. Weeks turned into months. Ezekiel continued to work on the ranch, trying to bury himself in the routine. But the past wouldn't stay buried. It gnawed at him, reminding him of his failures, his regrets. One day, Callahan called him into his office. He sat behind his desk, his face grim. "Ezekiel," he said, "I need to ask you something." Ezekiel's heart pounded in his chest. He knew what was coming. "There's been some talk," Callahan continued, "some whispers. About your past." Ezekiel remained silent, waiting. "I don't care about your past, Ezekiel," Callahan said, his voice softening. "Everyone deserves a second chance. But I need to know the truth. Are you running from something?" Ezekiel looked at Callahan, his eyes filled with pain. He knew he couldn't lie. "Yes," he said softly. "I am." He told Callahan everything. He told him about redemption, about Silas, about Thomas, about the choice he had made. He told him about Jedediah, about the guilt that haunted him. Callahan listened in silence, his face unreadable. White Wolf finished. He sat for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the floor. Finally, he looked up. "Thank you for telling me the truth, Ezekiel," he said. "I appreciate your honesty." He paused, then added, "You're a good worker, Ezekiel. And I believe you're a good man. But I can't have trouble on my ranch. You understand." Ezekiel nodded. He understood. "I'm going to give you some money," Callahan said, "enough to get you started somewhere else. But I think it's time for you to move on." Ezekiel accepted the money, his heart heavy. He knew Callahan was right. He couldn't stay here. He was a danger to everyone around him. He packed his few belongings, saddled his horse, and rode away from the ranch. As he rode, he looked back at the setting sun, casting long shadows across the land. He was alone again, adrift in the desert, with nothing but his memories for company. He didn't know where he was going. He only knew that he had to keep moving, keep searching for a way to outrun the darkness that clung to him like a shroud. He had to find a way to forgive himself, to find peace. But he didn't know how. The river still flowed, but the sea seemed farther away than ever. He rode for days, the landscape blurring into a monotonous tapestry of sand and scrub. He avoided towns, sticking to the less traveled paths, his food dwindling. The money Callahan had given him was burning a hole in his pocket, a constant reminder of his failure. He could spend it, buy supplies, perhaps even a new identity. But the thought felt hollow. What was the point? He was still the same man, haunted by the same ghosts. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, he came across a small, dilapidated shack. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a beacon of civilization in the vast emptiness. He hesitated, unsure whether to approach. He was tired, hungry, and desperately needed shelter. But the thought of interacting with another human being filled him with dread. He decided to risk it. He dismounted, tethered his horse to a gnarled mesquite tree, and approached the shack cautiously. He knocked on the weathered wooden door. A gruff voice called out, "Who's there?" "Just a traveler," Ezekiel replied, his voice hoarse. "Looking for a place to rest my head for the night." The door creaked open, revealing a wizened old man with a face etched with wrinkles and eyes that seemed to have seen too much. He was hunched over, leaning heavily on a gnarled wooden cane. Come in," the old man said, his voice raspy. "Don't just stand there like a scarecrow." Ezekiel stepped inside. The shack was small and sparsely furnished, but it was clean and surprisingly warm. A fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick, with the scent of wood smoke and something else, something herbal and faintly medicinal. "Name's Silas," the old man said, extending a gnarled hand. "What's yours?" Ezekiel hesitated. He didn't want to give his real name, not after everything that had happened. But he knew he couldn't lie to this old man, not after the kindness he had shown him. "Ezekiel," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Ezekiel," Silas repeated, nodding slowly. "Well, Ezekiel, you look like you've seen better days. Sit down, warm yourself by the fire. I've got some stew simmering on the stove. You're welcome to share." Ezekiel gratefully accepted the offer. He sat down on a rickety wooden stool near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into his bones. Silas ladled a bowl of stew and handed it to him. It was simple fare, mostly vegetables and beans, but it tasted like heaven. As he ate, Silas watched him with those knowing eyes. Ezekiel felt uncomfortable, as if the old man could see straight through him, into the darkest corners of his soul. "You're running from something, ain't you?" Silas said, his voice soft but direct. Ezekiel froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked up at Silas, his eyes filled with fear. "It's written all over your face," Silas continued. "The guilt, the regret, the pain. I've seen it all before." Ezekiel didn't say anything. He couldn't. He was afraid that if he opened his mouth, all the darkness inside him would come pouring out. "You can't run from your past, son," Silas said, his voice gentle. "It'll always catch up to you. The only way to find peace is to face it, to confront it." Ezekiel looked at Silas, his eyes filled with despair. "I don't know how," he whispered. Silas smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I can teach you," he said. "But it won't be easy. It'll be the hardest thing you've ever done. Ezekiel hesitated. He didn't know if he was strong enough to face his past, but he knew he couldn't keep running forever. He had to try. "I'm willing to learn," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. Silas nodded. "Good," he said. "Then let's get started." And so, Ezekiel stayed with Silas in the dilapidated shack in the middle of nowhere. He spent his days working alongside the old man, tending to his small garden, chopping wood, and learning about the healing properties of herbs. But more importantly, he spent his nights talking to Silas, sharing his story, his pain, his regrets. Silas listened patiently, never judging, never interrupting. He simply listened and offered words of wisdom and guidance. He told Ezekiel about his own past, about the mistakes he had made and the lessons he had learned. He taught Ezekiel about forgiveness, about compassion, about the power of redemption. Slowly, gradually, Ezekiel began to heal. The darkness that had clung to him like a shroud began to dissipate. He started to forgive himself, to accept his past, to find peace. He still had a long way to go, but he was finally on the right path. The river still flowed, and now he could finally see the faint glimmer of the sea in the distance. Silas's first lesson was silence. Not the absence of noise, but the active cultivation of inner quiet. He led Ezekiel to a clearing deep in the woods, a place where sunlight dappled through the leaves, and the only sounds were the rustling of branches and the distant call of birds. "Sit here," Silas instructed, gesturing to a moss-covered rock. "And listen. Not to the sounds, but to the silence between them." Ezekiel sat, feeling foolish. He could hear everything: the buzzing of insects, the creaking of trees, the frantic thumping of his own heart. Silence was the last thing he could find. "Close your eyes," Silas said gently, "and breathe." Ezekiel obeyed. He closed his eyes and focused on his breath, the slow, steady rhythm of inhale and exhale. But his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, memories, anxieties. He saw the faces of those he had wronged, heard the echoes of his mistakes, felt the familiar sting of regret. Silas remained silent, a still presence beside him. He didn't offer any guidance, any reassurance. He simply waited. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ezekiel's legs grew stiff, his back ached, his mind refused to quiet. He wanted to give up, to run back to the shack, to bury himself in the distraction of physical labor. But he remembered Silas's words, "It'll be the hardest thing you've ever done." And he knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. He had to face the darkness, to confront the demons that haunted him. So he stayed. He kept his eyes closed, kept breathing, kept listening. Slowly, gradually, the whirlwind in his mind began to subside. The thoughts didn't disappear entirely, but they lost their sharp edges, their power to wound. The memories faded, the regrets softened. He began to notice the subtle nuances of the forest, the scent of damp earth, the feel of the breeze on his skin, the warmth of the sun on his face. And then, for a fleeting moment, he heard it. Not the absence of sound, but a profound stillness, a deep, abiding peace that resonated within him. It was a silence that held everything, the joy and the sorrow, the beauty and the ugliness, the light and the darkness, all in perfect balance. He opened his eyes. The clearing looked different, brighter, clearer. He felt different, lighter, calmer. Silas was watching him, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Did you hear it?" he asked. Ezekiel nodded, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. I think so, he said. That's the first step, Silas said. Learning to find that silence within yourself. It's always there waiting for you. But you have to learn to listen. The following days were filled with more lessons, each one designed to chip away at the walls Ezekiel had built around his heart. Silas taught him how to meditate, how to forgive, how to accept himself. He shared stories of his own past, his own struggles, his own triumphs. He showed Ezekiel that it was possible to find redemption even after making terrible mistakes. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Silas asked Ezekiel to tell him his story. The whole story, from beginning to end. Ezekiel hesitated. He had avoided talking about his past for so long, afraid of the judgment, the condemnation. But he knew that he couldn't truly heal until he confronted his demons, until he spoke his truth. So he began to talk. He told Silas about his childhood, his dreams, his ambitions. He told him about the choices he had made, the mistakes he had committed, the pain he had caused. He didn't try to excuse himself, to justify his actions. He simply told the truth, as honestly and as completely as he could. As he spoke, the weight on his chest began to lift. The darkness that had clung to him for so long began to dissipate. He felt a sense of release, a sense of freedom. When he was finished, Silas didn't say anything. He simply nodded, his eyes filled with compassion. "Thank you," Ezekiel said, his voice hoarse, "for listening." "You're welcome, son," Silas said. "It takes courage to face your past. But you've done it. And now you can start to move forward." He paused, then added, "The next step is harder. You have to forgive yourself." Ezekiel looked at him, despair welling up in his eyes. "I don't know if I can," he said. Silas smiled a sad, knowing smile. "I know you can," he said. "Because you have to. You can't find peace until you forgive yourself. And you can't forgive yourself until you accept that you are worthy of forgiveness." He measured what the desert took, and what a man must leave to stay human.